The sound of snow shovels scraping against concrete filled the cold morning air. But 12-year-old Ethan Miller wasn't thinking about the frost biting at his fingers. He was thinking about how to make it through another week without worrying his mom. Ethan had woken up early that day, like he always did when it snowed. His small Ohio town seemed quieter under the thick blanket of white. But for Ethan, snow wasn't magical, it meant work. With his dad out of a job for months now, and his mom juggling 2 shifts at the diner, Ethan had taken it upon himself to help wherever he could. Most kids his age were still sleeping or excited about a possible school delay, but not Ethan. He grabbed the old shovel from the porch, bundled up in his too small coat, and got to work clearing their driveway before his mom came home from her overnight shift. As he shoveled, he glanced toward the house next door, Mrs. Harper's house. The driveway was untouched, snow piled high. Mrs. Evelyn Harper, a widow in her late 70s, lived alone. Ethan had seen her a few times, slowly making her way to her mailbox or waving from her porch. But they'd never spoken much. She was frail, her hunched shoulders and cautious steps making even short walks seem like a struggle. Ethan remembered hearing his mom mention that Mrs. Harper didn't have family nearby, which made him wonder who would help her now. He paused, leaning on his shovel. The snow was thick, and he was already tired. He had school in a couple of hours, and there was still plenty left to do on their own driveway. But as he thought about Mrs. Harper trying to clear all that snow herself, something inside him pushed him forward. She needs help, he muttered to himself, and before he could second-guess his decision, he trudged across the yard to her driveway and started shoveling. The work was slow and his arms ached, but Ethan kept going, determined to clear a path wide enough for her to walk safely. He was nearly halfway done when the front door creaked open. "Who's there?" a voice called out, shaky but alert. Ethan stopped and turned. Mrs. Harper stood in the doorway, wrapped in a thick sweater and scarf, her gray hair peeking out from under a knitted hat. Her sharp brown eyes squinted at him in the morning light. "It's me, Mrs. Harper." "Ethan," he called back, resting the shovel against his side. "I live next door." She stepped out cautiously, holding the doorframe for support. "What are you doing out here?" Ethan smiled sheepishly. "I saw your driveway and thought you might need some help. The snow's pretty heavy." Mrs. Harper's expression softened, though her surprise was evident. "Well, aren't you a thoughtful young man?" she said, her voice quieter now. "But you don't have to do that, dear. I don't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble," Ethan replied quickly. "I'm already out here shoveling hours, and I figured I'd just keep going." For a moment Mrs. Harper said nothing, her eyes studying him. Then with a small smile she nodded. "Well, thank you, Ethan. That's very kind of you." She disappeared back inside, and Ethan returned to his work. By the time he finished, his arms felt like jelly, and his cheeks were red from the cold. As he leaned on his shovel, catching his breath, the door opened again. Mrs. Harper stepped out, holding a steaming mug in one hand and a few crumpled dollar bills in the other. "Here," she said, handing him the money. "For your trouble." Ethan shook his head, stepping back. "Oh no, ma'am. I don't need any money. I just wanted to help." Mrs. Harper's brow furrowed. "But you worked so hard. You should take it." "It's really okay," Ethan insisted, a small smile on his face. "I'm just glad you don't have to worry about the snow now." For a long moment, Mrs. Harper looked at him, her lips pressed together as if searching for the right words. Finally, she sighed and smiled. "You're a sweet boy, Ethan. Thank you. Truly." He nodded, picking up his shovel. "You're welcome, Mrs. Harper. Let me know if you need anything else, okay?" As he walked back toward his house, he glanced over his shoulder. Mrs. Harper was still standing on her porch, watching him with a look he couldn't quite place, something between gratitude and deep thought. Ethan didn't think much of it at the time, He had done what felt right, and that was enough for him. But as he put the shovel away and hurried inside to get ready for school, he couldn't shake the feeling that this small act of kindness might mean more than he realized. The next snowfall came just 2 days later, blanketing the streets once more in a thick, pristine white. Ethan woke up early again, slipping on his worn boots and grabbing the old shovel. His breath puffed in the cold air as he tackled their driveway first, the repetitive scraping of the shovel against the icy ground filling the quiet morning. Once his family's driveway was done, he glanced at Mrs. Harper's house. Her driveway was untouched again, the snow piled even higher than before. Without hesitation, Ethan made his way over. He didn't need to think about it this time. It felt like the natural thing to do. As he started shoveling, he found himself working faster, his muscles already used to the rhythm. Halfway through, the door opened, just like last time. "Ethan?" Mrs. Harper's voice called out, a bit stronger than before. She was wrapped in her thick sweater and scarf again, her knit hat slightly crooked on her head. "You're doing it again?" Ethan paused, leaning on his shovel with a grin. "Morning, Mrs. Harper. Figured I'd get this cleared for you before you have to step out." "You're going to wear yourself out, dear," she said, shaking her head as she stepped carefully onto the porch. "You've got your own chores, don't you?" "I've got time," Ethan replied, brushing some snow off his gloves. "Besides, I like helping you." Mrs. Harper smiled, her cheeks rosy from the cold. "Well, I don't know what I did to deserve such a kind neighbor." She hesitated for a moment, then added, "When you're done, why don't you come inside for a bit? I'll make us some tea or hot chocolate." Ethan blinked, surprised by the invitation. He hadn't expected anything in return, but the thought of warming up sounded nice. "Sure, Mrs. Harper, I'll be done in a few minutes." True to his word, Ethan finished the driveway quickly, clearing a neat path to her front door. He stomped the snow off his boots and joined her inside, the warmth of the house hitting him immediately. The living room smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, and it was cozy, with shelves lined with books and framed photos of people Ethan didn't recognize. "Take your boots off and have a seat," Mrs. Harper said, shuffling toward the kitchen. "I'll bring the hot chocolate." Ethan did as he was told, settling onto the floral-patterned couch. He glanced around the room, his eyes landing on a large black-and-white photo on the wall. It was a wedding picture. The young couple in it looked happy, the bride holding a bouquet of lilies. He figured it must have been Mrs. Harper and her husband, though the man looked much younger and stronger than the frail woman he knew now. Mrs. Harper returned with 2 steaming mugs and handed one to Ethan. "Careful, it's hot," she warned, before sitting down in the armchair across from him. "So, young man, tell me, what's a boy like you doing out in the cold helping an old lady like me?" Ethan smiled sheepishly, taking a careful sip of the hot chocolate. It was rich and sweet, warming him from the inside out. "I just thought you might need it," he said simply. "My mom always says it's important to look out for people, especially when they don't have anyone else to help." Mrs. Harper's expression softened and she nodded slowly. "Your mother raised you right," she said. "I don't see that kind of kindness much these days." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Mrs. Harper spoke again. "And your family? How are things at home?" Ethan hesitated, twirling the mug in his hands. He wasn't used to talking about his family's struggles, but there was something about Mrs. Harper, maybe the way she asked, like she genuinely cared, that made him feel like he could open up. "It's been tough," he admitted quietly. "My dad's been out of work for a while. He's looking, but it's hard to find something steady. My mom's working a lot to keep up with bills, and I try to help where I can." Mrs. Harper listened intently, her eyes never leaving his face. "That's a lot for a boy your age," she said softly. "You shouldn't have to worry about things like that." Ethan shrugged. "I don't mind. It's just how things are right now. And I'm happy to help my mom." She works so hard. Mrs. Harper's gaze grew distant, as if she were lost in thought. After a moment, she said, "You remind me of my husband when he was young. He was always looking out for others, always trying to do the right thing. He'd have liked you." Ethan smiled, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," he said quietly. Mrs. Harper sipped her hot chocolate, then set the mug down on the side table. "You know, Ethan, I haven't had much company since my husband passed. It gets awfully quiet in this house. But having you around these past few days, it's been nice. I look forward to seeing you out there in the snow." Ethan felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the hot chocolate. "I'm glad I could help," he said. "And if you ever need anything else, just let me know, okay?" She smiled at him, a genuine, heartfelt smile that made her look years younger. "You're a good boy, Ethan. Don't ever lose that." They spent a little while longer talking about her years as a school teacher, her late husband, and the way the town had changed over the years. Ethan found himself enjoying the conversation more than he'd expected. It felt good to connect with someone, to see the joy his small efforts had brought her. When he finally left, the snow had stopped, and the sky was beginning to brighten. Mrs. Harper stood at the door, waving as he made his way back home. Ethan couldn't stop smiling as he stepped inside, the warmth of the morning still lingering in his heart. That day, something shifted between them. It wasn't just about shoveling snow anymore. It was about two people, each with their own struggles, finding comfort and connection in the simple act of being there for each other. The next few weeks passed with the steady rhythm of winter, snowstorms followed by days of shoveling and icy winds. Ethan continued to help Mrs. Harper every time the snow piled up, and their bond grew stronger with each visit. They had fallen into an easy routine. Ethan would clear her driveway, and afterward, she'd invite him in for hot chocolate and conversation. One afternoon, after yet another snowfall, Ethan finished the last swipe of her driveway and leaned on his shovel, catching his breath. The cold had seeped into his gloves, but he didn't mind. He was about to head home when the door opened and Mrs. Harper stepped out. She was bundled in her usual thick sweater and scarf, but this time she held a small, neatly wrapped box in her hands. "Ethan, wait!" she called, her voice carrying over the crunch of snow. He turned, surprised. "Yes, ma'am?" Mrs. Harper walked carefully down the shoveled path and extended the box to him. "This is for you," she said, her voice warm and steady. "I've been meaning to give it to you for a while now." Ethan blinked, looking down at the package. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper with a simple ribbon tied around it. "What is it?" he asked, hesitant. "Open it and see," she said with a smile, her cheeks pink from the cold. Ethan set his shovel aside and carefully untied the ribbon, peeling back the paper. Inside was an old, leather-bound notebook. The cover was worn but clean, and the edges of the pages were gilded, shimmering faintly in the winter sunlight. He opened it to find the pages blank, except for the first one, where Mrs. Harper had written in neat cursive, "For Ethan, whose kindness reminds me of all that's good in the world. May you always find joy in helping others." Ethan's throat tightened as he read the words. "Mrs. Harper, this is really nice, but you didn't have to give me anything." "Nonsense," she replied with a wave of her hand. "It's not much, but I thought you might like to have something to call your own. You've been so generous with your time and energy. I wanted to give you a little something in return." Ethan ran his fingers over the smooth leather, feeling the weight of the gift. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper," he said quietly. "I'll take good care of it." "I know you will," she said with a smile. "Now go on inside and get warm. You've done enough for today." Ethan nodded, tucking the notebook under his arm as he grabbed his shovel and headed home. He couldn't stop thinking about the notebook, about the care she'd taken to give him something so personal. It wasn't just a gift. It was a gesture that told him how much she appreciated him, how much she believed in him. The next day, after school, Ethan decided to thank Mrs. Harper properly. He saved a portion of his lunch money and stopped by the corner store on his way home, buying a small bouquet of daisies. It wasn't much, but it was all he could afford. When he knocked on her door, she opened it with a curious expression. "What's this?" she asked, looking at the flowers. "For you," Ethan said, holding them out. "I just wanted to say thank you for the notebook. It means a lot to me." Mrs. Harper's eyes softened as she took the flowers, holding them close to her chest. "Ethan, you didn't have to do this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I wanted to," he said simply. She invited him inside, and they spent the next hour talking and laughing over tea. Mrs. Harper told him stories about her late husband, about how he used to bring her flowers just because. Ethan listened intently, feeling a deeper connection to her with each story. It wasn't until a week later that the real surprise came. Ethan was coming home from school when he noticed a black car parked in front of his house. He hesitated on the sidewalk, watching as a tall man in a suit stepped out of the car and walked up to their front door. His mom answered, looking wary, but polite. Ethan hurried up the driveway, curiosity bubbling inside him. As he reached the porch, the man turned to him and smiled. "You must be Ethan," he said, extending a hand. Ethan shook it hesitantly. "Yes, sir. Who are you?" "My name is Mr. Caldwell," the man said. "I'm a lawyer representing Mrs. Evelyn Harper." Ethan's stomach dropped. "Is she okay?" he asked quickly, panic creeping into his voice. "She's just fine," Mr. Caldwell assured him with a chuckle. "She actually asked me to come speak with you and your family about something important." Ethan's mom looked between them, clearly confused. "What's this about?" she asked. Mr. Caldwell gestured to the door. "May I come in? It's a bit chilly out here." They all stepped inside, and Ethan's mom led them to the kitchen table. Mr. Caldwell set down his briefcase and opened it, pulling out a stack of papers. Mrs. Harper wanted to do something to show her gratitude for Ethan's kindness, he began, addressing Ethan's mom directly. "She told me about how he's been helping her with her driveway and keeping her company during these cold months. She said he's been a bright spot in her life." Ethan's mom glanced at him, her expression softening. "That's very sweet of her, but I don't understand." "Well," Mr. Caldwell said, flipping through the papers, "Mrs. Harper has decided to make a financial gift to your family. She's transferring $10,000 to your name, Ethan." The room went silent. Ethan's jaw dropped, and his mom looked like she might faint. "What?" she whispered. "It's true," Mr. Caldwell said with a nod. "She said it's her way of paying forward the kindness she's received. She doesn't have any family left, and she feels strongly about helping you all during this difficult time." I can't take that," Ethan stammered, his voice shaking. "It's too much," she insisted, Mr. Caldwell said firmly. "And I assure you, she's in a position to do so. This isn't a decision she made lightly." Ethan's mom covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. Ethan sat there, stunned. He thought about all the times he'd shoveled her driveway, all the afternoons spent talking and laughing with her. He never expected anything in return. He had just wanted to help. "I need to thank her," he said suddenly, pushing back his chair. "You can," Mr. Caldwell said with a smile. "But she told me to remind you that this is her way of thanking you." Ethan nodded, his chest swelling with gratitude and disbelief. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like things might just be okay. The following Saturday morning, a soft winter sun peeked through the clouds, casting a silvery light over the snow-covered streets. Ethan stood by the window, looking out at the neighborhood. His mom was humming in the kitchen, something she hadn't done in a long time, and his dad was flipping through the classifieds, circling job openings with a hopeful determination. The atmosphere in the house felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted. Ethan knew things were far from perfect, but for the first time in months, there was breathing room. He bundled up in his coat and scarf, grabbing his trusty shovel as he headed out the door. The snow wasn't as heavy this time, just a light dusting, but he knew Mrs. Harper would appreciate a clear path. As he approached her house, he noticed something unusual. Her driveway was already shoveled. He blinked in surprise, wondering if someone else had come by to help her. Before he could dwell on it, Mrs. Harper's front door creaked open. She stood there, smiling warmly, a woolen shawl draped over her shoulders. "Good morning, Ethan," she called out, waving him over. "Morning, Mrs. Harper," he replied, walking up to her porch. "Did someone already clear your driveway?" She chuckled softly. "I hired a service this time. I figured you deserved a little break." Ethan tilted his head, confused. "You didn't have to do that. I don't mind helping." "I know. You don't," she said, her eyes twinkling. "But I wanted you to come inside today. No shoveling, just tea and company." Ethan hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "All right," he said, stepping inside and stomping the snow off his boots. The familiar warmth of her home wrapped around him like a blanket. In the living room, the scent of lavender lingered as always. But something new caught Ethan's eye. On the coffee table sat a photo album, its leather cover slightly worn. Next to it was a small plate of cookies and 2 steaming mugs of tea. Mrs. Harper gestured for him to sit, and he settled into his usual spot on the couch. "I wanted to share something with you," she said, picking up the photo album and placing it on her lap. "You've been so open with me about your family, and I realized I haven't told you much about mine." Ethan watched as she opened the album, her fingers brushing over the first page. It was filled with black and white photographs of a young couple, smiling and holding hands. "This is me and my husband, Robert," she said, her voice soft with nostalgia. "We met when we were about your age, actually. He lived just 2 streets over." Ethan leaned in, fascinated. "You've known him since you were a kid?" "Oh, yes," she said, laughing gently. "He used to tease me terribly. But he had the kindest heart. Always helping out his neighbors, just like you." She flipped through the pages, showing him snapshots of their wedding day, vacations they'd taken, and moments from their life together. As she spoke, her voice grew livelier, and Ethan could see how much she had loved him. But there was a wistfulness in her eyes, too, a quiet ache for the life she'd once had. "I miss him every day," she admitted, closing the album. "But you know, Ethan, you remind me so much of him. The way you look out for others, the way you care. It's like a piece of him is still here." Ethan didn't know what to say. He felt a lump in his throat, overwhelmed by the depth of her words. "I'm glad I can help," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Harper reached over and patted his hand. "You do more than help, my dear. You bring light into this old house. And for that, I'll always be grateful." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their tea. Ethan found himself thinking about all the times she had invited him in, the stories she had shared, and the way she had quietly supported him without expecting anything in return. He realized that their friendship had become something far more meaningful than he had ever anticipated. As the day stretched on, Ethan helped her rearrange some bookshelves and dust off a few high-up corners she couldn't reach. It wasn't much, but Mrs. Harper insisted it made a world of difference. Before he left, she handed him a small tin of cookies to take home for his family. "Tell your mom and dad I said hello," she said with a smile, "and let me know if there's anything else I can do for you all." Ethan nodded, the tin tucked under his arm. "I will. And thank you, Mrs. Harper, for everything." As he walked home, the snow crunching under his boots, Ethan felt a deep sense of gratitude. He thought about how much had changed in the past few weeks, how his family's situation had improved, how his dad seemed more hopeful, how his mom smiled a little more each day. And he thought about Mrs. Harper, how her kindness and wisdom had become such an important part of his life. When he got home, his mom was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup. Ethan set the cookie tin on the counter and told her about his afternoon with Mrs. Harper. His mom listened, nodding thoughtfully. "She's a special lady," she said, "and she's lucky to have you looking out for her." Ethan smiled, but he shook his head. "I think I'm the lucky one," he said. That night, as he sat at his desk, Ethan opened the leather notebook Mrs. Harper had given him. He ran his fingers over the gilded edges of the pages, then picked up a pen. For the first time, he began to write not about his struggles or worries, but about the small moments of joy he had found in helping others. And as the words filled the page, he realized that his friendship with Mrs.